God gives his people Jericho. In our last story, we learned about Joshua leading God's people through the Jordan River. God parted the Jordan and split the waters so Israel could walk through towards the Promised Land. Now Israel finds themselves in the face of Jericho, a great city with vast walls. It is time to learn of God using unconventional tactics to take over a city. Inspired by the book of Joshua. Joshua sat quietly gazing at the city below. Night was drawing closer, and he had climbed a nearby hill to get a better vantage point. He studied the walls surrounding the colossal city. He measured them, and imagined his army attempting to breach it. Impossible. They would pick them apart one by one if they attempted to storm the city walls. If they entered through the main gate, it would be a funnel straight into the enemy's sword. Could they climb it? No. Could they avoid it? Not if they wanted to keep the land. If the people of Israel were going to have the promised land, the walls of Jericho had to be taken down. Joshua made his way down the hill with the sun setting behind him. Night had draped itself over the horizon like a warm blanket, and the stars began to sprinkle the sky. Joshua looked up and saw a man standing a few yards in front of him. The man was standing upright with his sword drawn in his hand. Joshua peered at the man, inching slower towards him with his hand ready to draw his sword. "Are you for us?" Joshua asked. "Or are you for our enemies?" The man looked at Joshua, seemingly uninterested in his specific question. "No," the man answered. "I am the commander of the Lord's armies, and I have come." As the words left the man's mouth, Joshua fell on his face. Joshua could barely speak with his face so close to the ground. "What does the Lord say?" Joshua said, words muffled by the dirt. "Take off your sandals, Joshua, for the place where you stand is holy ground." So Joshua did. Stories of old rushed into Joshua's mind. He was reminded of how Moses' journey once began, standing among God on holy ground. Joshua knew that God stood before him as a victorious commander. Joshua listened intently to what the battle strategy was. He would have never predicted what would come next. After receiving instruction, Joshua gathered his men to strategize. The morning had come, and the walls of Jericho blocked the early sun from shining across the valley. The walls were elevated and locked from the outside and the inside. Ever since the Israelites crossed the Jordan River, Jericho shut its gates so none could come or go. Joshua led his people towards the city. As one mass, the armies of Israel marched forth with the Ark of the Covenant before them. Leading the way were 7 priests with 7 ram's horns. As God had instructed, the army marched around the city walls silently. No man said a word. With intensity and purpose, they looked forward towards the Ark of the Covenant. The priests blew their horns continually, and the beautiful trumpeting sounds echoed throughout the valley. The people of Jericho watched, confused and relieved that there was no attack. For 6 days the armies of Israel marched once around the city. They said nothing. There were no battle cries, no swords banging against their shields, or violent shouts of war. Neither swords nor spears were drawn, but God was on the move. The men arose early in the morning on the 7th day. The cool dawn air filled the soldiers' lungs. The rest of Israel watched as they prepared to leave again. They strapped their armor to their chests, held their spears firmly, and marched forth to Jericho. This time the armies of Israel marched around the city 7 times. By the 4th time, the eastern sun was risen firmly in the middle of the sky. It beat down mercilessly. Beads of sweat dripped from the furrowed brows of Israelite soldiers. A cloud of dust followed them as they marched as one. The priests continued their trumpeting, signaling war. As the men finished marching across the city a 7th time, Joshua stopped and the army stopped with him, remaining silent. He turned to his troops. With a passionate voice, Joshua cried out, "Shout! Shout, for the Lord has given you this city! Today the city of Jericho will fall as an offering to God! Shout!" So the people shouted. A thunderous roar boomed from the army of Israel. Cries of war and trumpets echoed and shook the earth. One by one, the stones of the wall began to shift in their place. The walls of Jericho began to split. Cracks and clanging pierced the ears of everyone in the city as the walls began to crumble. The battle cries of Israel continued like the roar of a lion. The great walls of Jericho bowed before the might of God. The earth trembled as the wall fell to the ground. Screams of terror could be heard from the city. The broken walls stood before them, and Joshua, standing on one of the large stones, shouted to his men with sword raised high, "Take this city! Yet Rahab the prostitute shall live, and do nothing that will make your hearts stumble." The men stormed the city like a tsunami. Swords and shields clashed as the Jericho soldiers ran towards them. The sounds of war could be heard from miles away, and panicked screams littered the city. Flesh was torn from bone, and men tumbled on the floor wrestling. The ugliness of war and the blood of Jericho's soldiers painted the streets. Hours had passed, and screams were replaced with silence. Joshua drew a deep breath. They had won their first city. Jericho lay there crumbled and broken before them. Joshua looked to heaven and sighed deeply. He smiled, then continued forward to gather his people again. God had given them the land. The promises of God had never seemed closer. Yet there were more battles to be won, more blood to be shed, and more heartache to experience. The reputation of Joshua would glide across the land like a hurricane, and the reputation of God crumbling the walls of Jericho would shatter the hearts of all those who would come against Israel.